Thank you. And this is a great event, and thanks for inviting me here. So I have the feeling I'm going to pour a little bit of cold water into what we're talking about here, because I've been playing around with ChatGPT and LLMs for the past year. I'm imagining if I ask for a hand raise, a lot of you have played around it, do some data analysis on it. And it seems easy, and it seems incredibly smart, but it's really fast getting to the hard corners of what an LLM can't do. So the expectations is you have a data analyst for free. You just plug and play, you connect ChatGPT Enterprise to your data warehouse, you ask for some analysis, and it will give you the correct analysis with the correct data, with the correct insights. And it's the holy grail of self-serve analytics, i.e. no more stakeholders bugging me because they need analysis X, Y, and Z, and I am way behind schedule on something. They can just go to the chat prompt, ask away. Now, in reality, the current state is a little bit more complicated. One is it will hallucinate, which is a fancy word for making things up. Which makes sense. It is a language model, these LLMs. They are calculating the probability of generating the next token, be it code or analysis or anything. So you are dealing with something that is probabilistic in nature. So sometimes it will get stuff wrong. Now, caveat in my personal experience, and I'm sure some of you, it will be extremely convincing when it gets things wrong. I did a test a few months back where I asked ChatGPT to tell me the algorithm for a difference and difference study. And it's a deep econometric model. No point getting into the details of it. But the interesting part was ChatGPT gave me a very convincing answer that was slightly wrong in a very critical way. It mixed up the X's and the Y's. So if one of my junior analysts in my team would pick it up, go to ChatGPT, ask how to do it, and then implement it, he would get the wrong answer. But ChatGPT is incredibly convincing at it. And this is why I am a great proponent at Kindred of we should use these models, but always with a human in the loop. It needs to be checked. The second thing is that context is key. Now, these models were trained on the entirety of the internet. It's like having a junior analyst who has read everything there is to be read. But having the correct context, having the correct library for it to look for is incredibly helpful, because fundamentally that will shorten the problem space for the LLM to try and pick out the answer. So basically, in my opinion, at the moment, they are co-pilots. Really good co-pilots, but co-pilots nonetheless. Now, interestingly, LLMs are really bad at math, which for analytics is kind of important. Now, the screenshot is, and if we go back when Google launched Bard, everyone was talking about how Bard was getting things wrong, like fundamentally wrong. And then Microsoft did the demo for Bing Chat, and they flew under the radar with this one, but they did an analysis on the gap stock. And the demo was them pulling the gap data from the SEC filings and asking Bing, which is basically ChatGPT, Bing to do an analysis on revenue sales and with quarter-on-quarter measurements and forecasts. Here's the thing. It got every number wrong. It made the numbers up. The earnings per share, the revenue, the EBITDA, everything was wrong. and in a very convincing way. And the fact that math is hard even prompted DeepMind, for instance, of generating, they just did, I think it was last month, they call it alpha geometry, which is an LLM with another layer on top to help the model understand mathematics. And again, it's a complicated problem because math doesn't work like a language. So if you're analyzing numbers, if you're analyzing data, this is a big issue. Now, what they're mostly great at is code, because code is language, essentially. Code is just language with a more rigid syntax structure. So essentially, if you can model English language, you could model SQL, you could model Python. And if you then take GitHub and Stack Overflow and the entirety of what we have online as code bases and train one of these models on it, we get very good results. I was one of the early users on the GitHub Copilot when they were using Codex. ChatGPT just blows that out of the water. It just works. And syntactically is mostly correct. Now, this mostly part is important, and I will come back to it. Again, context will be key. And I had an interesting example last week. So I'm a manager, so I don't program as often as I did. And one of my analysts asked me, I need some help with some Power DAX query. And I said, OK, cool, I can help you. And I opened my Power BI desktop, and I haven't programmed in DAX in a few years, but OK, this is like riding a bike. And I decided to go into ChatGPT just for the fun of it and to test it, since I had this conference today. And I'm like, OK, this is the metric I want. Get me the code. And ChatGPT gave me a very long piece of code, a very long DAX measure, really fancy, that did absolutely the wrong thing. Copy-paste, error, 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 error. Now, first point, context is key. The moment I started sending to ChatGPT screenshots of, OK, you have this table, you have this data model, this is the structure at what you're looking, this is the value that I'm looking for, now it starts generating 80% right code, which is a good start. Now here's where I think these models really shine. Copy-paste into the measure board, into Power BI, errors. And I go and I copy-paste the code and the error line, and I say, look, Power BI is giving me this error at this line. Work it out. And after about 20 minutes, so this takes a while, you need to be patient with it. But after about 20 minutes, he got the answer right. I had my measure. So the way I tend to think about these models in practice, and the way I tend to think at work when I'm dealing with them, or when I'm trying to QA some piece of code for a book I'm writing, is I have a really junior analyst, and I need to teach him everything, and I need to have a very concrete eye out for little problems that experience gives me the answer to. So for documentation, for instance, I love these models, Code Llama, Llama 2, Mistral, ChatGPT, because they're really good if you just put the code in and you just ask him, can you document what this function does? It is absolutely awesome. He will do that. He just needs to be grounded into the right context of, this is the code, I just need you to explain to me what it does. Now, how can we, and what are the strategies to make some of these models a little bit better? Now, the first one is the easiest to explain and the most expensive, which is fine-tuning. Which is basically, you're picking up one of these models, and you are basically retraining it on a smaller, more concrete data set. So, anyone here ever saw Replit Code, the LLM, or Code Llama? the way they were trained, they're basically fine-tuning. So you pick up a 17 billion model or a 7 billion model, and you code it, you train it or retrain it on a smaller sample of data like SQL, and it will become way better at what you're fine-tuning at the expense of becoming worse at something else. So it won't give you Shakespeare, but it will give you correct SQL code. Now, this is expensive. You need GPUs. This is not something you can do, or it wasn't something you can do on your MacBook. This field is moving a little bit fast, so you do have some fine-tunings on Macs this week, but I'll leave that aside. But it's not something that usually you can do easily. Now, this also points out that if in companies you have data that only you have, for instance, in Kindred, in our sector, in the government sector, we have data that only we have, then fine-tuning one of these models specifically on our data set would yield better outcomes. Now, usually people don't start with fine-tuning. They start with RAG, which is basically giving it context. You have a pipeline where you try and send it the context like code bases or metadata for tables or DBT models, whatever your use case. And you can put that in the context window, which is basically the text you sent it, and say, look, with this context, i.e. you have this table with this type of columns, this foreign key, private key, this first sample of data, to ground it, generate me a SQL for X. Now, there's a lot of Medium articles where this technique is applied to SQL. And you kind of like easy, 10-step, 10 Python, usually using LangChain. And for very simple data sets, this works great. For more complicated data sets, we go back to the conversation of context and the next slide. But before we go to the next slides, another thing is the usage of tools, or in certain LLMs like OpenAI, then I'll call it function calling, which is going back to the old example of Bing getting the gap stock wrong. Instead of allowing the model to basically spit out the numbers and make them up, you can tell it, if you reach a point in which you need to do a calculation, hand off to a tool, for instance, Python or a SQL database. And then by trial, he will try and get the answer right, and when he gets it right, he will give you the accurate answer. Now, personal experience, sometimes this gets stuck, because he gets stuck in a loop with a wrong answer and a wrong idea, and you will never get the right data. Again, like a junior analyst who has 6 months worth of learnings, and he's kind of like getting stuck on a piece of code, and he needs a senior to tell him go right or go left. Now, semantic modeling. And this is where I'm really keen on using, at Kindred, start playing with this. As I said, context is key. And context, this is my personal view at the moment, and this field changes dramatically from month to month. But for me, context in the data side means semantic layer. Because going back to my previous point of you can have the simple Medium article saying the simple example of generating SQL. Data warehouses in the real world are messy. I don't know about yours, but mine has a lot of technical debt because that table does not have the foreign key that it should, or the campaign ID on table A means one thing, the campaign ID on table B means a totally different thing. And it got changed because it needed to be changed because something broke, and someone made a note of, I need to fix this, and never did, which means you don't have clean data from the start. What you do have is metadata for those tables, domain knowledge from people that are making these layers saying, well, campaign ID in this table means X, campaign ID in that table means Y, this joins with table A and table B. The DBT models, for instance, to help the LLM understand, okay, this table got made by that table, got made by that table, and this will give me that output. And with this interaction, you could then query the LLM, but on top of it. At Kindred, we're finalizing the contract for Fabric and Copilot. And I am really hopeful for it. Ask me in a few months how that went. But my hope is that once I put the data in one lake, and there's a key step here, which is making the semantic models in one lake, so that I can then put Copilot on top, and Copilot can understand the data. We can greatly improve the accuracy of these models. And for me at the moment, and your mileage may change, the good current use cases are QA and documentation. As I said, give it a piece of code, ask it to explain, or an interesting thing I was trying to do the other day, an MMM model, and I was fighting with a piece of code, and I had a bug in it. And I couldn't, for the life of me, figure it out. And I went to ChatGPT, and I told it, like, what's wrong with this code? And he said, well, this line, you're doing something wrong. This is the fix. And I'm like, OK, it works. You're correct. Copilot analysis, helping a lot of my analysis and a lot of my work when I'm using ChatGPT or other types of LLMs, I get 80% of the code for free. And then I need to worry about those 20% that require a little bit of insight. And that's massively helpful because instead of spending 2 hours or 3 hours, you can spend 1 hour on the 20% that actually matter. Database testing, we've been trialing this of A, generating fake data. Again, LLMs are great at that. And B, generating test use cases to basically connect to the database and test it. And with the proper context, opening a door on self-serve analytics. Not the more complex stuff, to be honest. I personally, at the moment, I don't trust an LLM with it. But the simpler stuff, like which I like to joke that I am a glorified pivot table maker sometimes, with the right context and with the right modeling, I do believe that these LLMs can accurately do that. And thank you. And I think I have 2 minutes to spare, so questions? You do have me on the panel after, so.
Well, LLM is based on semantics. Semantics are based on entities, most of them. And you go with metadata and across the panel, you got like other entities within each. If I'm not wrong, how do you allow each in every category you want to extract data or just to work with them?
So
Practical way.
You don't think of them as, when you're fitting context, and again, these models have been trained on a lot of code bases from GitHub because OpenAI got access to the entire GitHub code base. They are good at generating correct SQL, for instance. What they need, and I don't know if I would call them what you did, but what they need is the correct tables. And what I find from a practical standpoint, I'm not a mad genius who can do a model from scratch, but what I understand from what the model is doing, when you give it to the context window, for instance, you give it a table, first 10 rows, you give it the metadata for these other columns, you then give it the the foreign keys and the private keys. He will correctly identify how internally in the model, I don't know. And I think that's one of the problems with AI in general and these models in particular, which is you don't kind of know why they're doing what they're doing and how they're doing what they're doing. So it is a black box. But what I understand is that given that context, he will not generate fake code, for instance. If you have like punter key and campaign ID and KP ID, he will correctly assign the correct keys to the codes. If that's conceptual or if that's a category inside of the model, not entirely sure. And I think I'm out of time, so thank you.